19-year-old Kevin Johnson stood on Alsobrook Street in Kirkwood, Missouri, watching police officers search his neighborhood. His 12-year-old brother Joseph had just collapsed at home, and Kevin blamed one man for what happened next. Sergeant William McEntee had been on the Kirkwood force for nearly 20 years, a father of three who worked the tough streets of Meacham Park. But on July 5, 2005, McEntee became the target of a teenager's rage. When Johnson spotted the sergeant's patrol car, he didn't hesitate. He walked up to the vehicle, pulled out a pistol, and opened fire. Multiple shots tore through the summer air. McEntee, 43 years old and just trying to do his job, died on the street he'd sworn to protect. Johnson fled the scene, leaving behind a community in shock and a family destroyed. 3 days later, he turned himself in. But the case that followed would raise questions that reached far beyond one Missouri neighborhood. Questions about age, about justice, and about a daughter who would fight Missouri law just to say goodbye to her father. 17 years after that July afternoon, Kevin Johnson would face his own reckoning. But he wouldn't face it alone. To understand how a teenager ended up killing a police officer in broad daylight, we need to go back to the summer of 2005 and a family torn apart by addiction and poverty. Kevin Johnson Jr. lived in Meacham Park, a predominantly black neighborhood that had been absorbed into the wealthy, mostly white suburb of Kirkwood in 1991. The merger brought promises of better services and opportunities, but for many residents like the Johnson family, life remained a daily struggle. Kevin's younger brother, Joseph Long, went by the nickname Bam Bam. Born addicted to crack cocaine, Joseph lived with a congenital heart defect that made even simple activities dangerous. At 12 years old, he was small for his age, fragile, and completely dependent on his older brother's protection. Kevin had essentially raised Joseph himself, stepping into a parental role that no teenager should have to carry. The evening of July 5th started like any other summer day in Meacham Park. Kids played in yards, neighbors chatted on porches, and the heat hung heavy in the Missouri air. But around dinner time, someone called the police about fireworks being set off in the neighborhood. It was a kind of call that usually resulted in a warning, maybe a small fine. Nothing more. When officers arrived at the Johnson home, they weren't looking for Kevin specifically. They were investigating the fireworks complaint, asking routine questions, trying to figure out who was responsible. But as they talked to neighbors and family members, Kevin's name came up. Where was he? Had he been setting off fireworks earlier? Joseph was in the house during this conversation, listening as police asked about his brother. The stress of the situation, combined with his fragile health, proved too much. Right there, as officers stood in his living room, 12-year-old Joseph Long collapsed. His small body seized violently, his heart struggling against the defect that had plagued him since birth. The officers immediately called for an ambulance, but it was too late. Within minutes, Joseph was gone. The boy who had survived being born addicted to drugs, who had lived with a damaged heart for 12 years, who had depended on his brother Kevin for everything, died on the floor of his own home while police officers watched helplessly. Sergeant William McEntee arrived at the scene just as the ambulance was pulling up. He wasn't there for the initial fireworks call, wasn't involved in the questioning that had stressed Joseph. He was simply responding as backup, doing what any experienced officer would do when a child's life was on the line. But in Kevin's mind, McEntee became the face of what had happened, the man in uniform who represented the system that had killed his baby brother. Kevin wasn't home when Joseph died. He was somewhere else in the neighborhood, completely unaware that his world was falling apart. When he finally returned and found out what had happened, something inside him shattered. The brother he'd raised, protected, and loved was gone, and the police were to blame. For 3 days, Kevin Johnson walked the streets of Meacham Park, carrying a rage that burned hotter with each passing hour. He attended Joseph's funeral services, accepted condolences from neighbors, and planned his revenge. In his 19-year-old mind, the logic was simple. The police had killed his brother, so a police officer had to die. But it couldn't be just any officer. It had to be one who had been there that night, one who represented the face of what had happened to Joseph. During those 3 days, Kevin replayed the scene over and over. The officer standing in his living room, asking questions about fireworks while his baby brother sat nearby. The stress building in Joseph's fragile body as the conversation continued. The moment when his heart couldn't take any more, and he collapsed right there on the floor. Kevin hadn't been there to protect him, hadn't been there to tell the officers to leave, hadn't been there when Joseph needed him most. The guilt mixed with rage until Kevin could barely think straight. He'd raised Joseph from birth, changed his diapers, walked him to school, made sure he took his medication. For 12 years, Kevin had been more than a brother. He'd been Joseph's entire world. And when it mattered most, when Joseph needed protection from the stress that would kill him, Kevin had been somewhere else. McEntee had no idea he was being hunted. He continued his regular patrols, responded to calls, and tried to serve a community that often viewed him with suspicion. As a white officer in a predominantly black neighborhood, McEntee had learned to navigate the delicate balance between law enforcement and community relations. He'd been doing it for nearly 2 decades, building relationships, earning respect, tried to make a difference one call at a time. But Kevin saw it differently. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Joseph collapsing while officers stood around asking their questions. Every time he walked past a spot where the ambulance had been parked, the anger grew stronger. Joseph was gone, and someone had to pay for it. On the morning of July 8th, 3 days after Joseph's death, Kevin woke up with a clarity he hadn't felt since the tragedy. Today would be the day. He'd been watching McEntee's patrol patterns, learning his routine, figuring out the best time and place to strike. The sergeant followed the same routes, made the same stops, showed up in predictable places at predictable times. Kevin tucked a pistol into his waistband and left the house around 2 in the afternoon. The weapon wasn't registered, wasn't legal, wasn't something he'd owned for long. But in a neighborhood where violence was common and protection was scarce, getting a gun wasn't difficult. He'd acquired it after Joseph's death, during those 3 days of planning and rage, specifically for what he was about to do. The afternoon was hot, typical for a Missouri summer, and the neighborhood was quiet. Kids were inside escaping the heat. Adults were at work. And the streets that had been filled with grief and anger just days before seemed almost peaceful. Kevin walked with purpose, checking the time, calculating when McEntee would appear on his usual route through Meacham Park. At 2:40 p.m., Kevin positioned himself on also Brook Street. He'd chosen this spot carefully, a residential street with enough foot traffic that his presence wouldn't seem unusual, but quiet enough that he could approach a patrol car without attracting too much attention. He waited, checking his watch, feeling the weight of the gun against his hip. When McEntee's patrol car turned onto also Brook Street at exactly 2:52 p.m., Kevin felt his heart rate spike. This was it. No more planning, no more waiting, no more thinking about what might happen. The moment he'd been building toward for 3 days was finally here. McEntee was alone in the car, no partner, no backup visible anywhere on the street. He was driving slowly, the way cops do when they're patrolling a residential area, eyes scanning yards and sidewalks for anything out of place. When he saw Kevin walking toward him, he probably thought it was routine. Maybe Kevin had information about a crime. Maybe he wanted to file a complaint. Maybe he just wanted to talk. Kevin walked directly toward the vehicle, no attempt to hide his intentions, no hesitation in his step. His hand moved to the gun as he got closer, fingers wrapping around the grip while it was still tucked in his waistband. McEntee saw him coming, maybe even recognized something in Kevin's posture that suggested this was a casual encounter, but it was too late. When Kevin was less than 10 feet from the patrol car, he pulled out the pistol. McEntee had only seconds to react, to understand that this wasn't a routine encounter, that his life was in immediate danger. His hand moved toward his service weapon, but those seconds weren't enough. Kevin raised a gun and opened fire. The first shot shattered the driver's side window and hit McEntee in the head. The second shot followed almost immediately, ensuring there would be no survival, no chance for the sergeant to radio for help or defend himself. The veteran officer, father of 3, man who had spent 20 years trying to protect and serve, was dead before his body slumped forward against the steering wheel. His patrol car rolled forward slightly before coming to a stop against the curb, the engine still running, radio crackling with routine calls from dispatch. The sudden violence had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it had changed everything. McEntee was gone. Kevin was now a cop killer, and both families were about to be destroyed by the consequences of what had just happened. Kevin stood there for a moment, looking at what he'd done. The anger that had consumed him for 3 days was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. The finality of what had just happened. The reality that there was no taking it back. The knowledge that his life had just changed forever. He'd gotten his revenge for Joseph, but it felt nothing like he'd expected. He didn't run immediately. He stood on Brook Street in the July heat, holding the gun that had just made him a cop killer, processing the magnitude of what he'd done. Then finally he walked away. Not running, not panicking, just walking away from the scene like he was leaving a store or heading home from school. The case against Kevin Johnson was straightforward. He had confessed to the killing. There were witnesses and the physical evidence was overwhelming. His defense attorneys didn't try to claim innocence. Instead, they focused on mitigation, tried to save his life by explaining the circumstances that had led to the shooting. They painted a picture of a young man destroyed by poverty, addiction, and systemic racism. Kevin had been born into a world where opportunities were scarce, where violence was common, where police were seen as an occupying force rather than protectors. His mother's drug addiction had forced him to become a parent to his younger brother at an age when he should have been worrying about homework and high school crushes. The prosecution, meanwhile, focused on the victim. William McEntee was a dedicated officer, a loving father, a man who had chosen to serve in a difficult community because he wanted to make a difference. His death had left 3 children without a father, a wife without a husband, a police department without one of its most experienced officers. Whatever Kevin Johnson's motivation, whatever tragedies had shaped his life, he had made a choice to commit murder, and that choice demanded the ultimate penalty. The jury agreed. After deliberating for several hours, they returned with a guilty verdict and a recommendation for the harshest sentence available under Missouri law. Kevin Johnson would join the ranks of men waiting to die at Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre. But his legal battles were far from over. Appeals would drag on for 17 years, weaving through state and federal courts, raising questions about his age at the time of the crime, about the quality of his legal representation, about the racial dynamics that had influenced his prosecution. Each appeal will be denied, each petition rejected, each request for a clemency turned down. During those 17 years on Missouri's execution corridor, Kevin Johnson changed. The angry teenager who had gunned down a police officer became a man who expressed remorse for his actions, who understood the pain he had caused, who tried to make amends in whatever small ways were available to him. He completed his GED, read voraciously, and maintained relationships with family members who still believed his capacity for redemption. By November 2022, Kevin Johnson had run out of legal options. The Supreme Court had declined to hear his case. The governor had refused to grant clemency, and his execution date was set for November 29th. At 37 years old, he had spent nearly half his life in prison, most of it knowing that he would eventually face execution. In his final days, Johnson declined visitors except for his legal team and spiritual advisors. He spent his time reading, writing letters, and preparing for what was to come. Unlike many condemned prisoners, he didn't request a special last meal, choosing instead to eat the regular prison fare that had sustained him for 17 years. The execution itself was carried out with the clinical efficiency that Missouri had perfected over decades of state-sanctioned killing. Johnson was strapped to the gurney at 7:29 p.m. The 4 lines were inserted, and the sequence of drugs began flowing into the system. He did not offer any final words, no last statement to media or the victim's family members who had chosen to witness his death. At 7:40 p.m., Kevin Johnson was declared dead. The teenager who had killed a police officer in a moment of rage, who had spent 17 years appealing his sentence, who had grown into a man who understood the magnitude of his crime, was gone.